Good evening. Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Welcome. It's so wonderful to see so many people here. It is always a question on whether or not you should have the event start before 4 p.m. to catch the crowd that's leaving the university, or risk doing it after 5 so you can get people who are done with their obligations outside and who will venture to campus at that time, especially in this kind of weather. And so we chose to go after 5 because we wanted to engage the community. And we're really delighted that so many of you have come out tonight in not atypical weather for South Bend. I'd like to thank, first of all, the Center for Social Concerns that have made this event possible. They are partners for tonight's evening. And I'd also like to thank all of the faith leaders who are here. I see John Pinter from URC, Karen Campanez from Temple Beth El, Jane Pitts from the Women's Interfaith Circle. So, and I know I'm missing people, but whoever I can see, thank you all for coming. So many people from the community. I'd also like to thank, I think they have stepped out, Sheila and Asma for doing all the work behind the scenes to put tonight's event together and for coordinating with our speaker. This is an event of the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion. We're new kids on the block. The Ansari Institute was just founded in 2018, and last year we became operational, and we're working to develop our strategic plan, building an advisory board. But global engagement with religion isn't just about looking in Africa or Asia or South America, but also engaging the religious communities of South Bend. So we want to do a lot more with the local community and only increase this partnership. And Grand Valley State University, the Kaufman Interfaith Institute, where our guest speaker is a senior research fellow, is really an example for engaging the community. So we're really pleased to have him here with us today. This is Dr. James Kelly James Clark. I like to call him Clark Kent. I asked him permission to say this before. He looks a lot like Christopher Reeve. I don't know if you know the old Superman. So you definitely notice it when he comes up front. And he has a PhD from the University of Notre Dame in philosophy. He studied with Alvin Plantinga. He's taught at a number of institutions of renown around the world, including at Oxford University. He came back here to teach at Notre Dame as well. And he's now a senior research fellow at Grand Valley State University at the Kaufman Interfaith Center. Here they are. Please, a round of applause for Sheila and Asma for bringing us tonight's event. Now, some of you have had a chance to read this book, Strangers, Neighbors, and Friends. We had a few limited copies that we circulated. Others, if you ask a good question, I've been told you get a free copy, but it'll also be available here for sale. It's a riveting book, shows the personal journey of members from the 3 Abrahamic faith traditions. And I'm not going to spoil it, so I'm going to ask Dr. Kelly Clark to come up and say more about his co-authors and about this particular book. So please join me in welcoming Kelly Clark.
If you don't mind, I'd like to take just a quick selfie. You young kids get this, don't you? So if I could get, you got to move over a little bit. Everyone, smile. Got it. Plus. Just a second. Can you hear me now? Okay. All right. I just did slow-mo video as I walked over here. Let's go back to photo. Here we go. Okay. All right. Everybody now, smile. Thank you. I travel around the world now. I graduated from Notre Dame in 1985 in philosophy. And which means I'm 100 years old. And I knew her when she was a teenager. So, and it's great to be back. And I've traveled a long way since 1985. One thing I learned when I turned, it took me a long time, about when I turned 50, was that philosophy is almost completely irrelevant. And something you all knew, you're thinking, I haven't learned anything so far. This is how irrelevant philosophy is. The Notre Dame Journal for Formal Logic did a self-study one time, and they found out that their articles were read on average by 1.47 people. And in the 90s, I wrote about 10 articles on liberty and tolerance, religious liberty and tolerance. And if they were read by 1.47 people, and then you subtract my mom from 1.47, it means my articles were read on average by 0.47 people. After the turn of the century, but then especially after this, after 9/11, I just began to think that we can't just write about liberty and tolerance from an academic perspective. We can't just write two academics about liberty and tolerance. We can't just write really totally abstract articles that hardly anybody can understand and no one really cares about. It's time, at least for me, I was 50, I had tenure, I could do whatever I wanted. At least for me, to get out of the womb and start working harder in the world. And so I began to work harder and harder at how to communicate and how to communicate effectively to people who might need to hear about liberty and tolerance. I think in the US right now, it's different. Now the landscape has changed since 9/11. But so my main audience, for me, I'm a Christian, and I want to speak in the contemporary context in America to Christians. I think Christians need to hear message of compassion and peace that you hear from Jesus. So if you're a follower of Jesus, I think people need to speak to them of compassion and peace. I published a book, I think around 2010, and then, it was 2011, 10th anniversary of 9/11, called Abraham's Children. And I asked famous Muslims, famous Christians, and famous Jews to write from their own religious perspectives about liberty and tolerance. There's no end of articles, sort of Western liberal Enlightenment views of liberty and tolerance. But it's not the case that the whole world or all religious believers or even most people have bought into all the values of Western liberal Enlightenment. European, male, white. Not everyone has bought into that. So why should we always speak out of that perspective or that tradition? So I ask religious believers to speak from their own traditions and speak to people in their own traditions and speak in a way that people from outside the tradition might want to listen in on and learn from. So I got Jimmy Carter to write for it. Here's an interesting Jimmy Carter fact. I had a grant to do the book. Everyone who contributed got paid $5,000. When it came to the end, I contacted Jimmy Carter's assistant and I said, where should I send the $5,000? And Jimmy Carter said, just donate it to a local charity. Let me tell you a slightly different story. I tried to get Tony Blair, former Prime Minister, I tried to get him to speak at a conference on the 10th anniversary of 9/11, and he wanted $60,000 and not donated to my favorite charity. So Jimmy Carter, Tony Blair, just saying. And I also got the first democratically elected president of Indonesia, Abdurrahman Wahid. And if you don't know anything about him, I hope you find the book at least for free online and read his essay. It's the best essay in the book by far. And so I drop his name like I know. When I started this project, I didn't know a single Muslim in the world. Muhammad Ali, I take it back. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, I knew two. So I thought it was a good thing to bring Muslims, Christians, and Jews together, but I didn't know any. And the learning curve for me was steep, but it's been absolutely fascinating. It's a journey that I haven't regretted from the day it started. And the best thing about that project wasn't just putting essays together and putting them into a book. The best thing was on the 10th anniversary of 9/11, we all met together in DC, and we met each other for the first time. And my view is the thing that we need to do to overcome difference is to meet people who are different from us and talk to them and to hear their stories. And philosophers aren't all that big on stories, actually. We like arguments. I love arguments. I love to argue. I love arguments. I love to argue. I like to write arguments. I think I'm good at writing arguments. And then I read this study that said that if a person holds view A and someone holds not A, and then they argue, they both become more extreme in their views and more certain. Giving people evidence makes them, at least one of the two, at least maybe both, more certain of a false belief. You know, evidence can make people more dogmatic and more extreme. And I thought, I've been contributing to extremism with my great arguments. So I told my wife, I said, you know, honey, people aren't really that persuaded by arguments. And she says, honey, I've been trying to tell you that for years. So it wasn't like a big insight for me to tell her that. People aren't moved by arguments. So I wrote that book, and I like the book. I'm proud of the book, but it didn't really reach the audience that I wanted it to reach. And it didn't get out to that many people. And then I thought, I wrote the book, and then things just seem to be getting worse in the United States with respect to our compassion for people who are different from us. And especially our compassion for people who have different color skin than we have. And especially our compassion for Muslims. Just seems to have gotten worse and worse and worse since I wrote the book, which I didn't understand. But then I thought, well, I'm going to try to write something else. So I asked my co-authors to write a book that was aimed at younger people. I'm glad you're all here. Big white beards, good. This will be good for you too. Don't worry. But I aimed the book at younger people. I wanted to get people between the ages of 18 to 22 when they're most likely to be considering major life decisions. How do I want to order my life? How do I want to live my life? We wrote a book that was aimed at them. Each of the chapters is only 3 to 5 pages long, so it doesn't take that long to read. We wrote for the Twitter generation, maybe a little long for the Twitter generation, but 3 to 5 pages. And I said, and you can't have any arguments. We're not going to argue in this book. And you have to make a theological point each time. You have to have an authoritative text that you use to make a theological point, but you have to make the point with a story. And so they had to tell stories. So each chapter is a story. Sometimes it's a story about the author, so it's autobiographical. In fact, most of the chapters by my Muslim co-author, Aziz Abu Sara, most of his are autobiographical. He is a lot more interesting than I am. So he wrote about his life. And I'll tell you how interesting Aziz is. Has anyone heard his name? Aziz ran for mayor of Jerusalem about 1.5 years ago. He was on the cover of Newsweek, in the New York Times, and the Washington Post. Aziz is Palestinian, and he's not really a full citizen of Israel. What's that? Aziz Abu Sara. And I recommend looking up Aziz Abu Sara mayoral announcement, because when he announced that he was running for mayor, he was physically attacked. And he ran for about a month, but the Palestinians, Palestinians, if I can get anybody to stop doing anything it's talking about the Palestinians or the Jews or the Muslims, because there's not anything that turns out to be true after you say the Muslims and then fill it out, or the Palestinians and fill it out, or the Jews and then fill it out. There's nothing. So the Palestinians, some Palestinians in authority were not happy with him running for mayor. And so he had threats against his life. And some Jews who were in power in Israel weren't happy that he was running and threatened to ban him from Israel, his childhood home. And so after about a month, he about had a heart attack and withdrew from running for mayor. Aziz is the most interesting, and some of you may have heard of him because of running for mayor. Some of you are looking up right now. All right, kids, put your computers away unless I ban computers in my classroom, but you're okay.
Good idea.
Yeah. Aziz was my first choice as a Muslim to write for this because Aziz has won, I think, 3 or 4 Peace Awards. He's a National Geographic explorer. He's given TED Talks. He does tours of the Holy Land where you hear and meet people on both sides. People's lives are usually transformed. Instead of Christians going and getting a Christian, conservative Christian millenarian saying this is where God's going to crush the Arabs beneath his feet and reestablish the Jews in their homeland. You can hear people on all sides. If people go and do that, it turns out to really transform people's lives. And so Aziz's tours were named the #1 educational tour in the world a couple years ago. Aziz is a really cool guy. And I want to read part of his story here. And this is the first chapter. He says, each year during Ramadan, my dad would wake us before sunrise to drink water and eat before the start of the day's fast. One morning, my dad woke up around 4 o'clock. My brothers and I were tired in the morning. My brothers and I were tired and grumpy. After eating and drinking, we shuffled back to bed. I was 9 and shared a twin bed with my older brother, Taysir, who was 18. It was late spring, and the birds were starting to sing as the sky turned from black to navy blue to sky blue. I was dozing off when I heard a loud shouting and a heavy pounding on the front door. Our bedroom crashed open and a group of Israeli soldiers brandishing machine guns barged into our room. They ordered us to our feet and demanded our identity cards. I quaked in fear as my 4 older brothers handed over their documents. The soldiers never asked for mine. They examined my brother's cards, held a clipped conversation in Hebrew, and then grabbed Taysir and dragged him out. My mom cried and begged, pleading with the officer not to hurt him. She had heard about the Israeli military torturing Palestinian prisoners. The Israelis called it their break the bones policy. The authors promised that he would take Taysir and just ask him a few questions. This Ramadan was no celebration. It was one of the longest months of our lives. We were depressed, anxious, and helpless. We didn't find out where Taysir was being held for more than 2 weeks. The Red Cross eventually arranged for my dad to visit him. Dad returned from his visit visibly shaken. Although Taysir's mouth was bloodied, my brother said only that his tooth was hurting him. A few weeks later, I visited him. The journey to the prison took a full day of passing through dehumanizing checkpoints where we waited in long lines and were harassed by border guards. Once at the prison, I stared at my brother through the 2 fences that separated us. The visit lasted only a few minutes. I was barely able to say hello. He was released from prison about 8 months later. His body was badly beaten, the result of repeated torture. They didn't just ask him a few questions. They employed their hideous break their bones policy on my brother. We rushed Taysir directly to the hospital, but he had massive internal bleeding and liver and spleen failure. There was nothing the surgeons could do to save him. He died after coming out of surgery. My 19-year-old brother, Taysir, was tortured to death in an Israeli prison for being suspected of throwing rocks at military jeeps. Well, you can imagine the effect of this on a 9-year-old. So he says, Taysir's death enraged me. I was consumed by loss, emptiness, and fury. I spent the rest of my childhood feeling that I had a duty to him to avenge his murder and fight back against Israeli oppression. I was determined to avenge my brother's death. So he writes about becoming politically active against Israelis. And he concludes this chapter by writing, "The dismal life of a Palestinian boy, displaced, disenfranchised, and distressed, is fertile ground for the radicalization of justifiably angry young men." The book is worth the $10 if you want to get it. Students can have a free copy if they ask a question, but I'm selling the book at my cost, so $10, buy you the $30 book if you want to get it. And Aziz's story is the story of his de-radicalization. And I'll just say, in chapters like love and forgiveness, and what Aziz did himself is what he commends that people do, is that you walk across lines and meet people who are different from you. And the very first line, if you've been to Israel, you probably know this. Arabs ride in Arab taxis. Arabs eat in Arab stores and at Arab restaurants. Arabs live in the old city, in the Arab part of town. If you see the National Geographic special, Jerusalem, which is amazing, 45 minutes long. There's 15 minutes on a Muslim and 15 minutes on a Christian girl, like 13-year-old and a 13-year-old Muslim girl and an Arab girl and a 13-year-old Jewish girl. It's beautiful. But they each live in their little part of the city, and they don't know each other. And there's one really poignant scene at the end where they all cross but don't see each other. That's what it's like in Israel. And Aziz figured out if he was ever going to get ahead in Israeli society, he needed to learn Hebrew, and he went to Hebrew school. And he was one of the few Arabs in the class. I think he was the only Arab in the class. And the people in the class treated him like a human being. And from day one, it began to change his life. Anyway, read the book. Find out how he was transformed from a radical to really a warrior for peace. He's an amazing guy. You can read about him going to Afghanistan and being part of the negotiations for peace in Afghanistan. Just amazing story. I highly recommend it. I'm going to tell you one of my stories from one of my chapters, but I'm just going to tell it to you. I'm not going to read it. And I asked each person to write what they had learned from each of the traditions. So not just to talk about our own traditions, but also to talk about how coming into contact with people who are different from us changed us. And I want to tell this story because it involves Notre Dame. I was raised a very conservative Protestant in southwestern Michigan. And I was so conservative a Protestant, I remember in college hearing many sermons about how only people that believed in justification by faith, basically people that were raised pretty much just like me, were going to go to heaven. But those Catholics, they were all going to hell. That's how I was raised. And then, and I really believed it. Then I came to Notre Dame and started meeting those Catholics. And after a while, I just couldn't bring myself to believe that they were all going to hell. And actually I started talking to them and found out that what they believed wasn't that much different from what I believed on all sorts of things, including faith. And it didn't take too long before the transformative power of people meeting other people and hearing their stories had its effect on me. So, long before I graduated in 1985, I began to think of Catholics as fellow brothers and sisters in the faith. But those Muslims, that's what I thought then in 1985. Those Muslims, the problem with Catholics is that they believed in works righteousness. Protestant Christians believe that you get into heaven by God's grace alone. Doesn't matter what you do. Nothing in my hands I bring, simply to the cross I cling, we would sing. And so only by grace do you get into heaven. But Catholics all thought it's faith plus works. And then what we've believed about Muslims was they thought it was all works, really. That's what we believed. It was all works, that God kept complete track of your good deeds and your bad deeds. And if at the end of life, God opened up your book and the good deeds outweighed the bad deeds, you got into heaven. It was all works.
We were like extreme Catholics.
Yeah, you were like the worst Catholics. And exactly, yes, thank you. And I remember my first trip to a Muslim majority country. I went to Turkey, and I got into the home of a Turkish family, and they were a Muslim family, and there were Muslims that had gone with us on the trip, so they'd answered a lot of questions. But the thing that had gotten me the most is I didn't really all that understand Muslim prayer all that well. I just always thought that, like there's a story in the Bible where the Pharisee stands up and prays to God so everyone can see. And I thought, well, Muslims go to mosques and they pray 5 times a day so that everyone can see. Great work. God can see it. Everyone can see it. We all know. But I was at this family's home, and this will sound more familiar, my guess is, to all the Muslims here than what I just said. I got to this family's home, and we ate dinner, and near the end of dinner, the patriarch, not an old person, but maybe 40-year-old man, gets up and leaves and says he'll be back in a little bit, and makes no announcement, doesn't call it out or anything, except he does call this out. We hear the call to prayer through the window. And the people that stayed behind said, oh, that's so-and-so. He's leading the call to prayer tonight. He was an imam, and he was leading the call to prayer. He didn't call any attention to it. It was cool to know the person that did the call to prayer. So he's doing the call to prayer, and we're all sitting around, probably 20 of us around their table in the home, just jammed in. Wasn't a big apartment that they had. And then one of the Muslims would get up and leave and come back. And then another one would get up and leave and come back. And then another one would get up and leave and come back. And finally, I just thought, is it like a Muslim thing to run off to the bathroom or something? It's like, we Christians, we didn't need to go. We were just going to sit there. And they told me, and again, all you Muslims will know, they were just getting up quietly and discreetly and going to pray, and coming back quietly and discreetly and sitting down. Only when I called attention to their toilet, only when I called attention to it did it come up. And they politely explained what they were doing. And I just began to think no one was doing this to show off to anybody. They weren't rushing off to a mosque to do it in front of other people. They weren't even doing it in front of the people there. They weren't making a big show of what they were doing. They were just going off to pray. And then I said, well, what do you pray? And what is it that you pray? What are the first 2 lines that you pray in a Muslim, in your regular prayer? Well, hopefully somebody knows. What do you pray? What are the first couple of lines?
Praise to God.
Yeah. Sorry, did you say that in English?
Opening chapter.
Yeah. Will you just say it for us?
Praise be to God, be to Allah.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's just one, right? And what I began to think, and I began to think this about Catholics too, was that moving your body into positions was not a bad thing. Ritually, the religious rituals that people do were not bad things. They weren't works. They were just trying to get your body in line with what your spirit was supposed to be. And so I began to think that kneeling down and bowing all the way down to the ground and saying there's just one God, I began to think that was a good thing. Like you weren't just supposed to move your body, your spirit was supposed to get in this. It wasn't the body movement that was important. It was the ritual that gets your spirit where it's supposed to be. And that is, there's one God. There's one God. You repeat it over and over again. And in fact, I began to think that even atheists could profit from this. There's one God. There's one God. But I think really what's happening there when you do that ritual over and over and again is you're saying, I'm not God. I'm not God. There's one. And the most important thing is there's one, and it's not me. I'm not God. I think we're so tempted in our own lives to elevate ourselves sort of godlike above other human beings. You know, the Pharisee that I mentioned in the praying in front of other people says, thank God I'm not like other people. Thank God I'm not like other people. You ever go to the mall? You sit down, you watch people go by you in a mall, and there's somebody wearing clothes with all sorts of holes in it, and a wife beater T-shirt, and he walks by, and you say, oh, thank God I'm not, judge him like that. Then the woman comes by, and her baby's got, snot running down her nose and food on her. And you say, I'd never let my kid get away with that. And everyone that goes by you in like a second, you say, oh, I'd never wear my hair like that. I'd never do that. And we judge in like 1 second. Thank God I'm not like other people. And what would be good? Instead of sitting there doing that, quietly sneak off in the room and bow down and say, there's just one God, and it's not me. All of us could profit from that. And so I began to think that religious rituals were not only okay, but they were good. And I asked Aziz to write in here about prayer and about fasting and about the other pillars of Islam. Explain to us what it is Muslims do, and show us the beauty in it, so that people who are outside don't judge the way I judged. That people who are outside can look over your shoulder and say, oh, that's a beautiful practice. That's a powerful practice. That's what I learned from Muslims. One of the great things. Finally, I'll move to my Jewish co-author, Nancy Fuchs Kramer. She just retired, was a professor, rabbi at a Reconstructionist seminary in Philadelphia. She's the wisest, most charming of all of us. And well, if you get the point, I was pretty much the loser of the whole project, but those two are like awesome. It was really, we did a tour together, and we met each other for the first, I'd met Aziz, but we got to meet Nancy. And I came away so personally proud of my co-authors, although slightly embarrassed to have to stand between them. Nancy is the most, I didn't ask people to say all religions are the same. I didn't ask people to say underneath it all, we all agree. I asked people to say, is your tradition big enough that it can inspire and motivate you to love people who are different, who aren't in your tradition, or outside of your tradition, who are different from you? I thought Islam, Christianity, and Judaism had the sort of theological resources to motivate principled compassion and peace and liberty. And so I didn't ask people to agree. Nancy is the most agreeable. She's the most able to find underneath the surface things that people agree about. I suspect Reconstructionist Jews are the most likely not to disagree with people, except people who aren't quite as, they're fairly liberal. I didn't know that, actually. I knew nothing about, I didn't know what a Reconstructionist Jew was before I asked Nancy to write for it. Nancy writes this in chapter 6 about a midrash that pictured the angels in heaven arguing about whether human beings should be created. The Talmud tells us that the dispute did not end there. Two sets of rabbis were still debating the question in their own time. For 2.5 years, the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai argued, is it a good thing that God created humans? After all the votes were in, the verdict was clear. It would probably have been better if humans had never been created at all. But the rabbis concluded, since we are here, we had best examine our deeds. And Nancy writes this. I love that story. Hard as it is to believe, it really matters what we do with our lives. We can make them better each year. It's even more difficult to believe that the world is headed toward a final healing. The mystery is not neutral. It is weighted toward redemption. Where do we find dazzling confirmation of this truth? Nowhere. We cheat despair by saying, God, even when we can't see how the dots of our lives ultimately connect to form a picture. That is why it's called faith. We are asked in the face of the mystery to hope. Sometimes I wonder if we are being duped, but then I consider the example of those who have acted on such assumptions. Aid workers who enter war zones while others are fleeing. Ordinary congregants who spend vacations and summers transforming faith into bricks in building projects for the homeless in our cities. Their lives do not appear to me to be foolish or misspent. Hope doesn't feel like a mistake. In fact, it feels like an obligation.
Okay. All right, we're going to take a few questions, maybe about 10 minutes of Q&A, and then we'll call it a night. So those of you who have any questions, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Okay, I'll give a free copy of a book to a student if you ask a question. You have to ask a question though. I'm not just giving them away. If not, you can afford it. Even you students can afford it, because I look at it like this: $10 is 50% of a pizza. Okay, and this is more nourishing for your soul. So bargain it. Are you a student? All right.
Oh, here we go.
Here we go. Pass that back. All right.
Oh, first one.
So for better or worse, I graduated in 2017, and I've become a little cynical since then about the world, given the nature of today. But I feel at events like these, oftentimes we are preaching to the choir, if you will, and it's an echo chamber, right? And so something that I thought about is, we all, have our interfaith, and we might have friends of other faiths, and we, try to build those relationships. But how do you get to the people who are, that uncle that says this maybe not the correct thing at Thanksgiving?
Yeah.
How do you get to those people? It has to be a ripple effect,
Yeah.
right? And so it can't just be us talking at each other. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And one of the things I did was write this book to get to other people, or maybe to get to young people before they become your uncle that says the really awkward thing. I called two very conservative churches in Michigan and asked them, because we do the same thing. I work for the Kaufman Interfaith Institute. We have an interfaith Thanksgiving service. Everyone who comes loves it. And we all go, aren't we all nice? And we are all nice that show up there, and it's not that other people aren't nice. It's that sometimes they're not well informed, and sometimes they haven't met people that would change their lives. I asked those churches to do this. They're conservative churches, neither of whom have any relationships with Muslims in their communities or with Jews. And I asked them to, one of them's my brother. That made it easier. Another's a friend from high school. We've stayed friends on Facebook. And I just said, would you do this? Would you go to your churches and organize this? Some of you have a study and you read this book. And then in April, you invite the mosques that are near you and the synagogues that are near you. You fix a meal and you serve the people who are different from you. And I think it can only, everyone always asks me people always ask me, no one where it matters, what can we do in Israel? And I think, I don't really know what we can do in Israel, but I know this: you could walk down the street and talk to your neighbor. And they don't bother to do that. So you have to sort of put people in positions where they do that. And white Christians are the people in power in America right now, and they need to serve. So I asked them. I didn't tell them that. I didn't tell them you need to serve. I just said, would you do this? Would you would your church put the money towards buying some food and then serve the people who are different from you? And so 2 of them are going to do it. And I want to do one in Dearborn. I partly want to do it in Dearborn because a lot of white Christians in America think that Dearborn is ruled by Sharia. And what that means is that if you steal something, you get your hands cut off. And they say that police from Detroit, do all of you know this? I don't want to preach to the choir on this, but in right-wing media, they think Dearborn, Michigan, the most populous Muslim city in the United States, in the right-wing media, you can read it on there, the police, Detroit police are afraid. They're not afraid to drive around Detroit of all places, but Dearborn, for God's sake, they drive to Dearborn and they won't go in. They stop at Dearborn. Even the police are afraid to go in. And it's all ruled by Sharia law. They don't understand what Sharia is. It's horrible what people think about Dearborn. So I want to contact churches in Dearborn and see if they'll do it for the mosque. So every place that I travel, I ask if I can give a talk on this. So I've given this talk I've given it at Al-Azhar University for 1,000 years, probably the most influential Muslim university in the world. I was told I'd never get in there. I had 200 young people at that university come to my talk. I was mobbed afterwards, which I'm hoping you do, but not expecting it. They were awesome. It was almost all students. They were just awesome. Anyway, and you can do it. You could do something. So, but I agree. It's the question that has to be asked. You definitely deserve that book.
Hi.
Are you a student?
I'm not a student, and I hate it when people, when they're asked to ask a question, make a statement, but I just feel I really would like to offer another perspective about Israel, because you've mentioned a couple of things about Israel. I'd just like to mention that there are actually quite a lot of groups and individuals in Israel who are reaching across lines, Jews and Arabs, Muslims, Israelis working together. So I just wanted to offer that perspective in this forum. Thank you.
Yeah, all 5 of my Jewish authors of Abraham's Children live in Israel and work for peace, all 5 of them. And I went to Israel the first time on behalf of that book, and I met so many people of goodwill working for Jews in Israel working for peace that it shocks me that there isn't peace there. It just shocks me. There are so many people of goodwill that want peace in Israel. Jews of goodwill who want peace in Israel. Our book is not a political book. It just so happens that Aziz works with a Jewish partner, both for peace. Maybe you know the Parent Circle or the Concern Circle, where people who've lost, Jews and Palestinians who've lost someone in the Intifada, they go together and work for peace. And by the way, Rami Elhanan and I think it's Bashar Aramin, a National Book Award winner, wrote a book about the friendship of those two. And Steven Spielberg, and so the book has just come out. Like I ordered it, I haven't received it at my home. They're doing a book tour. And Steven Spielberg has just agreed to make it into a film, the friendship of a Jew and a Palestine in Israel who work together for peace. There's a documentary about them. By the way, I have a website called Abraham's Children. And I have about 20,000 followers, and I use it to point out people who work for peace. It's good news on religion, because usually all you hear in the media is the bad news. I also point out if there's anti-Semitism that's happening in the world, or bigotry against Muslims that's happening in the world, to remind us that we still have to fight these battles. But there's a lot of good news about religion that's about the Abrahamic traditions that's in there. Thank you. Yeah.
Take the mic.
My name is Chen, and I'm Israeli. And it's also, I agree with the rabbi, and it's also important for me to mention that if you walk in Israel, there are many different realities. And I was pretty annoyed when you talked about a really specific reality. because if you walk in Israel, many cities in Israel, you can see Arabs and Jews eating together in restaurants. And many cities, they just live together, like Haifa, like Yaffo, like Jerusalem. And also studying in universities together. And every year, there's a big organization of people who their siblings died in terror. Both Palestinians, Palestinians, Arab Israelis, and Jewish Israelis, who are doing their memorial ceremony every year together. That they're understanding that both sides are affected from the situation. So it was just important for me to say that Israel, it has so many different realities, and it depends on how you look and what you want to see. You can whatever you want to see, you will see. So it really depends on your political view and what you want to see, because you can see soldiers treating really badly for Palestinians, but you can see that the IDF has many strict rules that every soldier that passes those rules most of the time is getting punished and even goes to jail for this. So there are many, just a wide spectrum.
So I've been to Haifa, and I totally agree. I meant to say what his reality is. Aziz never met a Jew until he went to...
And there are many Palestinians and Jews and Israelis who never meet. Like this is also... Yeah.
So again, I just want to say, except that this was the backdrop of Aziz and his path towards peace. We don't talk about politics in the book. The book is apolitical.
So one more. And how many more hands? We're going to do maybe...
Are you a student?
No.
Oh, maybe two more.
Yeah.
Hi, I just wanted to share my experience with the first time I met a Jewish person. Because when I was growing up, I used to see how Jews used to kill Palestinians, Palestinian kids throwing stones to the Jewish police. So there was a time I was flying from Nairobi to Lusaka. It was like 3 or 4 hours flight. And the next person was sitting beside me was a Jewish. After the plane had taken off, and he took out his passport, and I saw those Jewish writings, and I was shaking. Like, I was like, he's going to kill me. You understand me? That was, I think it was an ignorance. Because in the middle of the flight, me and him, we were talking. And by the time we arrived in Lusaka, I'd forgotten even what happened. So I think sometimes we judge people because we don't spend time with them. We don't sit down with them and experience them. I lived in Ireland for a while. The masjid that we used to go to, it was a synagogue. The area used to have a lot of Jewish, and they had moved out of the area, so they sold the synagogue to the Muslims. And I want to share another experience between the Jewish and Muslim. During the First World War in France, and you can find this in Al Jazeera. It is a documentary that I saw it myself in Al Jazeera. During the First World War, the Jewish were killed by the Nazis. So in France, the Muslim used to give Jewish IDs so that they can pass as Muslims. Sometimes, in order to control people, you get all this, they will tell you this and that so that they can stay in their place. But socially, I think it's very easy to cross those barriers. And we're all equal, and when you live together, like another example I can give, before I came to the...
Well, that's two is probably good.
Sorry?
2 examples is probably good, because she has a question too.
Okay. No, it's okay. I'm not a student. I just want to share my experience.
Yeah. Oh, that's great.
But I think we just have to live together to know each other, or visit each other and learn about each other to understand about other people, to break the barriers and the differences. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I have a question for you. Let's say you're sitting with a bunch of right-wing, crazy Nazi morons, as we would say. What would you try to say to them to try to break through that mentality to stop that hatred? Because we see a lot of it from the white wing. We have a lot of anti-Muslim groups around here, anti-Jewish groups around here. So
Should we add the last question and then
Okay,
do them all together?
Let's put it, but not from here.
Yeah, so I had the opportunity to read your book and really appreciated it. One thing that I think really stood out to me, and you referenced even as you were talking about standing in the mall and how quick we are to judge, and I really love, I think one word that you highlight in the book as something that we need to overcome is this sense of superiority. But I'm curious if you could speak a little bit, and so as somebody who shares your faith background as Christian, I know that a number of people struggle on this because as part of our faith, we believe deeply in the superiority of Jesus. And therefore, I think for a lot of Christians, it's hard. How do you distinguish or unravel? I think for a lot of Christians, there's this fear that to take a posture that's not superior is that unfaithfulness to our own faith tradition in believing that, well, Jesus is superior. So if I take this posture of not being superior, then I'm unfaithful to the one I claim to worship. So just invite you to speak to that.
Yeah. So I'll take your question first. So there's a lot of things that I do. So I took your selfies. I do this wherever I go. And so I did it in Amman 2 weeks ago, and I'll do it in Istanbul in 2 weeks. And I've done it in Egypt with that group there. And I take photos and I tell the audience, this is why I do it. And it's because so many people in America are bigots and they think all Muslims want to kill us. And I try to normalize people's views of Muslims. I try to photo document what I do to normalize Americans' views of Muslims. I have some right-wing people that are on my Facebook feeds. My guess is a lot of them just turn it off after a while. They're not going to listen. That's the problem is we've become increasingly siloed, and social media has aided that. But anyway, that's one thing I try to do, and it does get people's attention, and people do comment, and sometimes they comment just privately to me, and it has made a difference. And sometimes I say things to people like I've been there, I don't think it's like that, or I might say something self-deprecating. In fact, you're saying you saw the Hebrew writing and you were scared because there was a Jew sitting next to you. And I often will tell Muslims when I go to speak in Egypt, this is often the story I start with. I work professionally to bring people together. This is what I do now. This is how I view my vocation now as a philosopher. And I've been working hard at this for a long time. And when I went to Iran for the first time, when the pilot said, "You've now crossed into Iranian airspace," most of the men in the plane said, "Allahu Akbar," in unison. And I about had a heart attack. Honestly, I thought this is it. And I had to talk myself. The bomb didn't go off, and I had to tell myself, "Oh, yeah, that's right. Not all Muslims are trying to kill us." But just like that, like it's in us. Bigotry's in us. We've been, and you got it. You had it the second you saw that writing. It happens. Things.
I was 14.
Yeah. So these are things we just have to keep working at. And I haven't arrived. I'm still working on it. And so I might say that, or I might tell people where I've gone or what I do. Sometimes I don't say anything. I won't repeat this, but one of my wife's best friend's husband is one of those people. And he said some of the vilest things that I've heard anyone say about Muslims.
And I told my wife later, I wish I had said, so I thought later what I should have said one night. And I have gotten more directive with him, but his most vicious night, I said nothing. And I was ashamed. And I'll tell you why I'm ashamed. And I wrote a blog for a long time for the Huffington Post, mostly against Islamophobia, sometimes against anti-Semitism. But I wrote it because I think people who are not in power can't speak for themselves, and sometimes other people need to speak for them. And so those people that you were talking about aren't going to listen to you, but they might listen to me. And so I need to muster up a little more courage sometime. Anyway, I figured that out the next day, and I try sometimes to say some things, but often I just tell people this is what I do. I do bridge building projects that bring Muslims and Jews together, and then you see what happens. Or I try to bring people together, but it's hard, as you already pointed out. It's hard to bring the people that need to hear. It's hard to get them in the room with people that they need to hear from. So my view is that nobody. The problem with this sense of superiority is it affects every part of our lives, including our spirituality. Our spirituality is not immune. Whatever we do spiritually, we all think is better than what everybody else does. And my goal in the book wasn't to get people not to think that their religion wasn't true, but my goal was to get people to think that doesn't make me superior. If I'm saved by grace, it doesn't make me, less a sinner. Or so I don't try to talk. I didn't ask anybody that wrote for this book to sort of downgrade their tradition, and I didn't try to do that in what I wrote. But I do try to tell Christians this: the Jesus that you profess to follow says really clearly that you have to love the stranger, the neighbor, and the friend. You even have to love your enemy, it says. And so I have a chapter on that, loving your enemy. And you don't get to feel superior to your enemy. You're supposed to love them the way, like a child. So Jesus models what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to kneel down at their feet and say, what do you need? And so that we have the model for love. It's not standing up on the Mount of Transfiguration, look at us. I'm here with Jesus and Moses, and there's an angel right there. Look at me up on this hill. I'm superior because I got it all figured out. And then what Jesus does in the very next. Oh, and then the disciples say this when they're up on the Mount of Transfiguration. They get in an argument. If the story is real, there's God, there's Jesus glorified, and you know what the disciples do? They start arguing which one of us is the greatest, and which one of us gets to sit on the right hand of Jesus. They get in an argument there, and so they get down. You haven't figured it out yet. That's not what it's all about. And then Jesus comes down, and he kneels at the foot of a child and says, this is what you're supposed to do. It's not elevating yourself. It's bowing down at people's feet in love. And so I just say, if you call yourself a follower of Jesus, it's not that you're the greatest. In fact, the whole Gospel of Mark, I think, was the disciples trying to figure out who's the greatest. And if you read the end of the Gospel of Mark, by the way, none of the disciples get to see the risen Jesus, because none of them is humble. They're all prideful. And so the gospel ends with the disciples' life in a wreck. That's how the Gospel of Mark ends. It's not a big triumphal story. It's about disciple failure. And the failure is people thinking that their relationship to Jesus makes them great. And Jesus is saying, no, that's not how you're supposed to be a follower of me. If you want to be a follower of me, you have to bow down like at the feet of the child, which is what he did, and love people that way. Hey, let me close with, this is the last paragraph of the introduction. I stand on the beach and watch the rushing water seek out all the low places, its wriggling fingers reaching out to find and fill empty space. Its reach exhausted, another wave follows and fills those empty places. And another, there are always more than enough, abundance. I want to extend my arms in grace and mercy to find and fill the world's empty spaces. When compassion and joy fill in the holes, the cracks and crevices, the nooks and crannies and hidden places, peace and harmony overflow with the rightness of the world. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you. I'd like to thank all of you for coming. And I didn't recognize Professor Chad Meister from Bethel University, or Muhammad from the Fetzer Institute. So we have a lovely group of people here. I know it's over, but I want to just mention one thing. What Kelly Clark didn't say was how he begins his section where he's driving down the road and he had just gotten through with teaching, was it at a youth group?
Oh, yeah.
And he encounters somebody walking on the side of the road in the snow, and he had just finished preaching about the Good Samaritan, so he had to stop. And he ends up taking this guy home because he wanted to drive 300 miles, and he said, no, I'm not going that far. And then he finds out he's a drug addict and an alcoholic. And he houses him in his home. And then at night, he and his wife start hearing noises. He's rummaging through their stuff. And so I'm not going to give away what happens. It's an interesting conversation he has with his wife. But it's really a gripping account of somebody who's really living a life that they preach. So we want to thank you for coming and sharing your story and your stories, and for bringing this place to life today. And thank you to the community for being out here. Have a wonderful evening.